Before we begin, if this story moves you, if it keeps you up past the hour you intended to sleep, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about the people history forgot to celebrate. Stories about second chances earned in silence and snow, in the long, hard work of learning to trust again. This is one of those stories. It begins with a letter and a woman who never knew her husband had already said goodbye. The letter she never read, a widow's secret that changed everything in 1886 Montana. The letter had no date. Nora Callister had read it so many times that the paper had softened at the folds, the ink bleeding slightly, where her fingers always lingered on the third line where Thomas had written her name. Not Nora, not Mrs. Callister. Just the private name he had called her since the first winter they spent together, when she had been 18 and he 22, and the world had seemed like a place that rewarded patience. She called her Nor, one syllable, half a name, the kind of thing a man only writes when he is not sure he will get to say it out loud. She had assumed when she found the letter tucked inside his second good coat 3 weeks after the funeral that it was something he had written during one of their arguments. They had not been frequent, but they had been real the way all real marriages contain real disagreements, and that he had never given it to her because the argument had resolved itself and the letter had become unnecessary. She had read it once in the cold silence of their bedroom, standing in her dress and her grief, and she had decided that was what it was. A letter that was no longer needed, evidence of a tenderness that had never required evidence. She had kept it anyway. That had been 18 months ago. 18 months since Eli had asked where Papa was, and she had knelt in the dirt of the front yard with her good dress getting muddy and tried to explain the word gone to a 5-year-old who did not yet understand that some goings were permanent. 18 months since she had sat across from Reverend Cole in his sparse office and listened to him speak about God's will and the mysterious nature of providence, with an expression on his face she had not been able to name at the time. She could name it now. Relief. The morning she stood at her kitchen window and watched the first real snow of November settle over Harlan Creek, Montana territory, she was thinking about the letter again. Not its contents, she had memorized those long ago, but its paper, its weight. The particular way Thomas had pressed too hard with his pen on the word promise, as if the word alone required more force than the others. I promise you, Nor, that everything I have done and everything I have chosen, I chose because of you and Eli. Not to leave you, never to leave you. To make sure that when the leaving comes, because it will come, it always comes, you will still be standing. She had thought he meant death in the ordinary sense, the kind all people eventually faced. She had thought it was a romantic man's way of saying I love you in the language of mortality. Standing at the window with her coffee going cold, she was beginning to wonder if she had been wrong. Mama. Eli appeared at her elbow in the way children do suddenly, completely as if they had been conjured by the simple act of thinking. He was wearing one boot and carrying the other, his dark hair sticking up on one side from sleep. He was 6 now. He had Thomas's eyes, that particular shade of brown that looked almost amber in direct sunlight. Warm and thoughtful and older than the face they occupied. Your boot, Nora said. I know. He held it up as evidence. The lace is broken. I'll fix it after breakfast. He set the boot on the table and climbed into his chair with the practiced efficiency of a child who had long since made his peace with the fact that mornings required effort. Nora poured oats into the pot without measuring. She had been cooking by instinct for so long that recipes felt like suggestions made by people who had more time than she did. Through the window, Harlan Creek looked the way it always looked, and under fresh snow, briefly beautiful and immediately indifferent to that beauty. The main street was not yet busy. The general store would not open for another hour. The mine office, where Thomas had worked as a surveyor for 3 years before the accident, had its lights on already because Denton Marsh kept early hours and expected the same of everyone in his employ. The mine office. Nora turned away from the window. She did not look at the mine office if she could help it. She did not look at Denton Marsh if she could help it. She did not think about the way he had appeared at her door 2 days after the funeral, and he had in hand, voice soft with practiced sympathy, to inform her that Thomas had borrowed money from him, a significant sum, and that while he had no wish to cause her additional distress during this terrible time, the debt would eventually require settling. She had not known about any debt. That was the thing she kept returning to in the quiet hours after Eli slept. Thomas had not been a secretive man. He had told her when he bought a new pair of work gloves and spent more than he intended. He had told her when he lost $2 at cards with the other surveyors and felt guilty about it for a week. He had told her things she had not asked to know because honesty was the way he loved her. Not romantically, not with flowers or speeches, but with the daily practice of having nothing hidden. And yet, he had apparently borrowed $400 from Denton Marsh without mentioning it. And now Denton Marsh's lawyer, a thin man named Pruitt, who wore his coat like he was perpetually cold, had sent a second notice. A formal one. Nora had 10 days to repay the sum or vacate the property. The cabin had been in Thomas's family before it was theirs. His father had built the main room with his own hands. The kitchen addition was Thomas's work completed the summer before Eli was born, the smell of fresh cut pine lasting for months after. $400. She had 47. Mama, the oats are burning. They were not burning, but they were close. Nora lifted the pot and set it on the cool side of the stove and told herself, as she had been telling herself for weeks, that she would find a way. That there was always a way if you looked long enough. That Thomas would have found a way. She was less certain of that last part than she used to be. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday. Nora noticed him because Eli noticed him first, the way children always notice things that adults had trained themselves to overlook. They were coming out of Breck's dry goods with a pound of cornmeal and a block of large small purchases, carefully chosen, when Eli stopped on the boardwalk and pointed. Mama, that man has 2 horses. The man in question was tying both animals to the post outside Harlan Creek's only hotel, a narrow 2-story building called the Territorial that had aspirations its exterior did not support. He was tall, dressed in trail clothes that had seen real use, not the decorative frontier costume of men who wanted to appear rugged, but actual dust-worn canvas and leather that had been repaired multiple times in multiple places. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that was not old but had stopped being young some time ago, weathered by something beyond sun and wind. He moved with the economy of a man who had spent years learning not to waste effort. He turned as if he felt them looking, or perhaps simply as part of his general habit of knowing what was behind him, and his eyes passed over Nora and Eli with an attention that was professional in its thoroughness and careful not to become impolite. He had a quality she could not immediately name. She would not name it until later. What she noticed first was what he lacked the performance of self-assurance that most men in a new town either overcorrected toward or abandoned entirely. He seemed neither eager to be known nor particularly concerned about remaining unknown. He was simply there in the way a tree was there, occupying space, observing weather, making no particular argument about it. 2 horses means he's going somewhere, Eli said with the authority of a child who had worked this out himself and was proud of it. Or coming from somewhere, Nora said. They walked home. She did not think about the stranger again until that evening when Eli asked at supper what a detective was, and she looked up from her bowl and asked where he had heard that word. From Mr. Deakins at the store, Eli said. He said a detective came to town. He said it to Mrs. Deakins, but I heard. Nora set down her spoon. Did Mr. Deakins say why? No. Eli considered the question with more seriousness than it perhaps required. But Mrs. Deakins made a face, the face she makes when something is happening that she already decided she doesn't like. Nora knew the face. She had been on the receiving end of it often enough. She went to sleep that night with the word detective sitting at the back of her mind, like an ember that was not yet fire-present warm, not yet anything in particular. Jesse Vane had been a Pinkerton agent for 9 years. He had left the agency on a Thursday afternoon in September, 3 years ago, in the offices of their Chicago branch. He had set his badge on the desk of his supervisor, a man named Holden, who was thorough and pragmatic, and had never once asked Jesse how he felt about the work, and he had said 2 sentences. I'm done. Don't write to me. Holden had nodded as if he had been expecting this and picked up the badge and set it in a drawer without comment. That had been worse somehow than argument would have been. Jesse had walked out into the September city and stood on the sidewalk for a long time watching people move past him with destinations and purposes and the ordinary assumption that tomorrow would resemble today in all the ways that mattered. He had thought about a man named Franklin Greer. He thought about Franklin Greer most days in the way you thought about a thing you had done that could not be undone. A calculation you had made with confidence that had turned out to be wrong in ways that mattered more than the calculation. Franklin Greer had been innocent. Jesse had built the case against him with the careful precision he brought to all his work. He had been thorough. He had been professional. He had followed the evidence where it led, and where it led was to Franklin Greer, a quiet man from a small Colorado mining town who had been in the wrong place with the wrong associations and the wrong kind of ordinary guilt on his face when Jesse came to ask questions. Jesse had been certain. He had learned over 9 years to trust his certainty. He had been wrong. The evidence, as it later emerged, had been arranged by a man named Denton Marsh, a mine operator in the Colorado Territory who had been running a fraud scheme involving falsified mineral surveys and investor money that disappeared into claims that never produced what they promised. Franklin Greer had stumbled into proximity with the scheme without understanding what he was near, had spoken to the wrong people, at the wrong time had written a letter to his brother that mentioned Marsh's name in a context that looked damning when excerpted and explained when read in full. Jesse had not read it in full. He had excerpted it the way you excerpted things when you were building a case and the case already felt solid. Franklin Greer spent 8 months in a federal facility before a witness came forward with information that reoriented the investigation entirely. He was released. Jesse was already in another state by then, already on another case, already doing the work the way he had always done it, thorough, professional, and not yet fully understanding what he had broken. It was not until he went back to Colorado to the small town and the ordinary house that he understood the cost. Franklin Greer's wife had taken the children and left during the trial. The house was sold to cover legal expenses. Greer himself was out of jail, but had no home to return to, no work that would have him no standing in a community that remembered what it remembered regardless of the correction. Jesse had sat in a rented room that night and written a letter to Franklin Greer that he never sent. He had revised it 16 times before accepting that there was nothing to say that would make the mathematics work differently. He had quit 3 months later. For 3 years, he had taken private work, the kind that required investigation, but not the kind that required certainty about guilt, missing property, disputed deeds, records that needed finding. He had kept track of Denton Marsh from a distance the way you kept track of something that was not yet ready to be confronted, but was also not something you could put entirely down. Marsh had moved north, Colorado to Montana, leaving behind a completed fraud and a series of investors who were already entangled enough in the scheme's profits that pursuing him legally was complicated by their own exposure. He had brought money and connections and the smooth operational confidence of a man who had done this before and intended to do it again. He had set up in Harlan Creek 18 months ago. The same month Thomas Callister had died in a mining accident. Jesse had noted the timing. He had noted several things. He had come to Harlan Creek not because he was certain he was no longer in the business of certainty, but because the pattern was familiar in the way that things you had seen before were familiar, and he had learned the hard way what happened when you recognized a pattern and chose not to name it. He registered at the Territorial Hotel as a land surveyor passing through on his way to the Bitterroot Valley. It was not exactly a lie. He was carrying surveying equipment. He had used it professionally enough times to answer questions about it convincingly. He put his saddlebags on the room's single chair and sat on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about what he knew and what he still needed to find out. Thomas Callister, mine surveyor, married 1 child, dead 18 months ago in what the accident report described as a roof collapse in the secondary shaft of the Marsh Creek mine. The report had been signed by the mine foreman and witnessed by Reverend Aldous Cole, who had no particular reason to be witnessing a mining accident report, except that Cole was on Denton Marsh's town council committee and appeared to be in the habit of witnessing things for him. The widow had received notice of a debt 2 days after the funeral, $400 allegedly borrowed in the months before the accident. Jesse had seen this kind of debt before in Colorado. It was a tool, a way to acquire property from people who could not fight back, who were already disoriented by grief, who could not afford a lawyer and had no one to explain to them that a verbal loan agreement with no independent witnesses was not, under most territorial law, legally enforceable without documentation. He wondered if Nora Callister knew that. He suspected Prewitt Marsh's lawyer had not informed her. The first thing Jesse Vane did in Harlan Creek after breakfast, and before anything that could be called investigating, was walk to the edge of town where the mountain ran close to the road and stand in the cold air and look at it for 10 minutes. It was a habit he had developed after Colorado. Before he began any work, he made himself stop, made himself notice where he was, the actual physical place, the specific air, the particular quality of light. It was a way of insisting to himself that this was real, that the people here were real, that the choices he made here would have real consequences for real people who had not asked to be caught in the crosscurrents of his work. The mountain did not care about this. The mountain was indifferent in a way that Jesse found for some reason reassuring. He had been in town 4 days before he found a reason to speak to Nora Callister. He had not arranged it. He was not yet certain enough of anything to arrange introductions that could come later when he understood the terrain more fully. The meeting happened because Harlan Creek was small, and the boardwalk in front of Breck's Dry Goods was narrow, and Nora was coming out as Jesse was going in, and Eli slipped on a patch of ice in the doorway and went down fast. Jesse caught him. He did it without thinking, the reflexive response of someone who had spent years training himself to react before thought, to move toward problems rather than away from them. His hand closed on the boy's coat collar and then immediately adjusted to something less abrupt, steadying him by the shoulder and setting him upright in one motion. Eli looked up at him with Thomas's amber eyes and said without apparent concern, "I didn't fall all the way." "No," Jesse agreed, "you didn't." "Eli." Nora was there immediately, close her hand already on her son's other shoulder in the simultaneous checking for damage and restoring of contact that mothers performed without having to decide to. She looked at Jesse. "Thank you." "He's fine." Jesse stepped back. "Ice gets slick when it warms a little, worse than when it's properly frozen." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, something more considered, both of them performing the evaluation that strangers performed on each other in small towns, which was essentially, do I know anything about this person? And if so, what? "You're the surveyor," Nora said. "Jesse Vane." He did not correct the characterization. "You're Mrs. Callister." Her expression shifted slightly, barely perceptibly, but Jesse was in the habit of watching expressions the way other men watched weather. "Do people point me out when strangers come to town now?" "No one pointed you out." He paused, deciding how much to offer. "I was a surveyor in the Bitterroot. Thomas Callister's name came up when I was researching the Harlan Creek claims." "I'm sorry for your loss." Something moved behind her eyes. Not grief, she had moved past the acute phase of grief into something quieter and more complicated. What he saw was more like recognition, the particular look of someone who has heard a piece of information that fits against another piece of information they already had, and is deciding whether to examine the join or to pretend it is seamless. "He was a good surveyor," she said. Her voice was even, controlled, not because she was cold, but because she had learned he suspected that evenness was a form of protection in a town that was watching her. Eli tugged her sleeve. "Mama, I'm cold." "I know." She looked at Jesse one more time, that same careful measuring look, and nodded. "Good morning, Mr. Vane." "Morning?" He watched them walk away. The boy reached for her hand without being asked, and she gave it without looking down. They moved like people who had made an accommodation with difficulty, not defeated by it, but marked by it in ways that had become functional part of how they operated. Jesse went into the dry goods and bought a bag of coffee he did not particularly need, and thought about the way she had said he was a good surveyor. Not he was a good man, not he was a good father, not any of the things people usually said about the dead. She had said what he was, as if that was where the truth lived. Jesse had been in Harlan Creek for 11 days when he found the second piece. The first piece was the accident report, which he had obtained from the county office by presenting himself as a land title investigator, which was technically also not entirely untrue, and which contained, buried in the foreman's terse account of the collapse, a detail that had no reason to be there. The notation that the secondary shaft had been cleared of workers at the start of the shift due to concerns about ventilation, and that Thomas Callister had returned to the shaft alone against protocol to retrieve his survey equipment. Survey equipment. Jesse had been a surveyor, actually, and practically for long enough to know that no professional surveyor left his equipment underground at the end of a shift. You brought your instruments out because they were expensive and because the underground environment degraded them. It was not a rule that had to be taught. It was common sense that any working surveyor acquired quickly. Thomas Callister had been a working surveyor for 3 years. So either he had left his instruments underground for a reason that was not about the instruments, or someone had told the foreman that he went back for instruments as a way of explaining why he was alone in a shaft that had been cleared. Jesse sat with this for 2 days before the second piece arrived. It arrived in the form of Marsh's mine foreman, a man named Decker, wide-faced and deliberate, who drank alone at the far end of Harlan Creek's single saloon each Wednesday evening, with the focus of a man performing a necessary function rather than enjoying himself. Jesse sat near enough to observe without proximity that would read as interest, and on the third Wednesday he heard Decker say something to the barkeep that required no context to land with weight. "I keep clear of widows," Decker said to no one in particular, and apparently continuing a conversation he had been having with himself. "Once is enough." The barkeep, a practical man named Ott, who had the particular immunity of barkeeps everywhere, to the confessional quality of things said in his establishment, wiped the bar and said nothing. Doesn't matter anyway, Decker continued. He was not drunk. He was not even close to drunk. He was speaking with the flat clarity of someone who had been carrying something and had found in the anonymous air of a near-empty saloon a moment where it could be partially put down. Nothing to be done about it now. Jesse left before Decker noticed him. He walked back to the Territorial in the cold November dark and stood at his window and looked at the mine office where Denton Marsh's light was still burning and thought about Thomas Callister going back for instruments he would not have left. The following morning, he walked to the edge of town and stood with the mountain and looked at it for 10 minutes. Then he walked to the Callister property. Nora opened the door with flour on her hands in an expression that had already been shaped by other kinds of mornings, the kind where visitors meant trouble before she saw who it was. And then the expression did not exactly relax, but rearranged itself into something more calibrated. Mr. Vane, Mrs. Callister, I apologize for coming without notice. He held his hat. I have a professional question, if you're willing to hear it, about your husband's work. She studied him for a moment, then she stepped back from the door. The cabin was small and lived in the particular way that spaces occupied by people who had real lives became lived in, not disordered but arranged by the priorities of function and comfort, rather than appearance. A child's drawing was tacked to the wall near the window. The table had been cleared of breakfast, but still carried the warmth of a recent meal. In the corner, a pile of mending waited with the patient permanence of work that never ran out. Eli looked up from the floor where he was arranging small stones in a pattern only he understood. He considered Jesse with the direct assessment of a child who had not yet learned to be polite about scrutiny. You're the man who caught me, he said. You did most of the catching, Jesse said. I just slowed you down. Eli appeared satisfied by this accounting. He returned to his stones. Nora poured water into a pot and set it on the stove without asking if he wanted coffee. It was, Jesse noted, the response of a woman who had been raised to offer hospitality regardless of circumstance, performing the motion automatically, even as the rest of her remained alert and uncertain. She dried her hands on her apron and sat at the table without sitting fully, her weight forward ready. What kind of professional questions, she asked. Jesse sat across from her. He placed his hat on the table between them. The kind where I need to ask you to trust me before I've given you reason to. And I want to be honest about that first, rather than after. Her eyes were gray. The light from the window made them look the color of the sky before snow, which was also the color of a held decision. You said my husband's name came up in the Bitterroot survey research. That was true as far as it went. How far did it go? He looked at her steadily. Thomas was looking at the same mineral claims I'm looking at, not as a surveyor, as someone who had found something that didn't match. The silence after he said this was the kind that had weight to it, the kind that meant something had been confirmed that had not previously been spoken aloud. How do you know that? Her voice had not changed. She was good at this, he noticed, at keeping her voice level when the rest of her was doing something else. Because the survey reports he filed in the last 4 months of his employment show one set of numbers, and the reports Marsh's office filed with the Territorial Land Office show a different set. I compared them. They don't match in the way that errors don't match. They match in the way that deliberate adjustments match. He paused. Thomas Callister was documenting the discrepancy, quietly, carefully, the way someone does it when they know they are in proximity to something dangerous and they want to be sure the record exists regardless of what happens to them. The flour was still on her hands. She had not wiped it off. Regardless of what happens to them, she repeated. I'm sorry, Jesse said. It was not enough. It was also the only true thing he had available in that moment. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the snow that had been threatening all morning began falling with the soft indifference of things that did not require permission. Eli was still arranging his stones. The coffee water began to heat. There's a letter, Nora said finally. He left me a letter. I found it in his coat. Jesse waited. I always thought, she stopped, began again. I thought it was from an argument, that it was something he'd written and not needed to give me. She looked at her hands. He wrote I chose because of you and Eli, not to leave you, to make sure that when the leaving comes, you will still be standing. Jesse was very still. I thought he meant death in the ordinary sense, she said. The way people think about death when they're being romantic and morbid at the same time. Her voice was even. It cost her something to keep it even. What you're telling me is that he meant a specific leaving. I don't know for certain, Jesse said. I want to be honest with you about what I don't know. But you think so? I think Thomas Callister knew something was wrong. I think he was trying to make sure the evidence survived him. He paused. I think the letter is not the only thing he left you. Nora looked up from her hands. He was methodical, Jesse continued. The way his survey notes are kept, the way he cross-referenced his own records. He was a man who understood that documentation required redundancy. If he was keeping a private record of something, he would not have kept it in one place. The flower on her hands, the letter in Thomas's coat, the number written at the bottom of the third page of the letter that she had always assumed was a date or a verse reference or some private notation she had never thought to decode. She got up abruptly and went to the bedroom. Jesse sat at the table and waited. Eli, without looking up from his stone, said, "She keeps the letter in the cedar box." "I know," Jesse said, and then realized he shouldn't have said that, and was grateful that 6-year-olds generally did not follow implications. Nora came back with the letter. She laid it on the table and smoothed it with hands that were no longer entirely steady. She pointed to the bottom of the third page, a sequence of numbers and letters, 11 characters, and below them 2 words, North Corner. Jesse looked at the numbers, then at the words, then at Nora. "Does the cabin have a root cellar?" he asked. She looked at him, "Or a section of floor that doesn't match. A stone in the fireplace that sits differently. Anything your husband built or repaired in the last year of his life that he insisted on doing himself." The silence stretched, and then something shifted in Nora Callister's face. Not surprise, but the arrival of understanding that had been waiting at the door for a long time, assembling itself piece by piece, and had finally been let in. "The kitchen addition," she said, "the north corner. He laid the floorboards himself. He said it was something he wanted to do without help." She stopped. I thought he was being proud. He was being careful, Jesse thought. He said, "I'd like to look, if you're willing." She nodded once. She folded the letter and held it against her chest for a moment, the way you held something that was simultaneously beloved and rearranged. Then she led him to the north corner of the kitchen Thomas had built with his own hands the summer before Eli was born, the smell of fresh-cut pine lasting for months after. The floorboard was the third from the wall. Jesse noticed the difference immediately, a slight variation in the nail-head placement, the kind of inconsistency that a careful man introduced deliberately when he needed to be able to find something again. He produced a short pry bar from his coat, a surveyor's tool actually used for marking stakes, and worked the board up with minimal force. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, was a ledger. Nora sat down on the kitchen floor without deciding to. She sat down because her legs made the decision for her. Jesse set the ledger on the kitchen table and they opened it together. It was Thomas Callister's handwriting. She knew every loop and angle of it, methodical and clear. Organized by date. The dates began 14 months before his death and ended 3 weeks before the accident. The ledger contained 2 columns on every page. The left column, the survey numbers Thomas had officially recorded. The right column, the actual numbers he had measured in the field. They did not match. They did not match in a way that was systematic, that followed a pattern that could only have been the result of intentional falsification of the official record. The actual numbers showed that the primary and secondary shafts of the Marsh Creek mine were producing at roughly 40% of what was being reported to investors. The falsified numbers filed by Marsh's office with the Territorial Land Office showed production that justified the investment capital Marsh had been drawing in from Denver, from Chicago, from St. Louis. The scheme was not complicated. It was, Jesse thought, with a cold and familiar recognition, almost exactly what he had encountered in Colorado 3 years ago. Overstate production to attract investment, draw investment money, use a fraction of it to maintain the appearance of operation. Move the rest. Eventually the mine either produced or it didn't. If it did, you came out ahead. If it didn't, you disappeared before the collapse. Thomas Callister had measured the real numbers, had watched the real numbers get replaced with false ones, had kept his own record with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he had found and exactly what it meant, had left it under the north corner of his kitchen floor for someone to find. Jesse looked at the last entry. The date was 3 weeks before the accident. The notation in the right margin in Thomas's careful hand was 5 words. "He knows I have this." Nora had been reading it over his shoulder. She was very still. "He knew," she said. "Yes, he knew, and he didn't." She stopped. "He didn't leave. He didn't take us and leave." Jesse said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only honest response to a truth that was still being understood. "He stayed," she said. "He stayed, and he built this floor, and he put this here, and he—" Her voice broke on the last word just slightly. just the smallest fracture, and then she held it. He was protecting us, the only way he could think of. She touched the last entry. He knew if he ran, Marsh would follow. He knew if he made it obvious, it would happen faster. He thought, she understood it now, the whole shape of it, the way a man who knew he was in danger and could not get his family out of it would think. He thought if he stayed calm and quiet and kept the record, there would be something left after, something that couldn't be buried with him. The flour on her hands had dried. The snow outside had thickened. Eli was in the other room arranging his stones, constructing something patient and private. Jesse looked at the ledger, then at the woman sitting on the floor of the kitchen her husband had built. Denton Marsh had been very careful. He had the accident report. He had the foreman. He had Reverend Cole's witness signature on the paperwork. He had a lawyer with a fraudulent debt claim that was technically difficult to disprove without the kind of documentation most widows did not have. He had not accounted for Thomas Callister's understanding of redundancy. He had not accounted for the north corner of the kitchen floor. He had not accounted for the fact that a man who knew he was going to die does not go quietly, does not stop working, does not stop loving his wife and son in the only language available to him. At the end, the language of evidence, of careful records of a floor laid board by board with hands that were in their own way saying, I promise you, Nor. I chose because of you. What happens now? Nora asked. Her voice was steady again, completely steady with the particular steadiness of someone who has passed through the worst understanding and come out the other side still standing. Thomas had wanted her standing. Jesse looked at the ledger. Now, he said, we make sure this reaches the people it needs to reach. Carefully, without Marsh knowing what we have until it's too late for him to act on it. That takes time. Yes. She looked at him with the gray eyes that were the color of held decisions. How long are you staying, Mr. Vane? Jesse thought about his saddlebags in the hotel room, about the mountain at the edge of town, about the question he was actually being asked, which was not a logistical question at all. As long as it takes, he said. She nodded once. She got up from the floor. She went to the stove and poured the coffee that had been heating since before the world changed, and she set a cup in front of him, and she sat down across the table with the ledger between them, and she began to read from the beginning. Outside, Eli called from the other room, Mom, I finished my stones. It's a mountain. I see it, she said, though she couldn't. It's a good mountain. The snow fell. The coffee steamed. The ledger lay open between them with all its careful columns, all its evidence of a man who had chosen in the only way left to him to make sure the people he loved would still be standing. They had a great deal of work to do. The arrangement was practical. That was how Nora described it to herself in the days after Jesse Vane moved out of the Territorial Hotel and into the barn behind the Callister cabin. Practical. He needed a reason to be near the property without attracting the kind of attention that would return to Denton Marsh's ears. She needed someone who could fix the fence line that had been sagging since September and would, if left through another winter, collapse entirely. He paid for his board and labor the way itinerant workers had always paid on the frontier. And if the work was often secondary to the other work, the quieter, more dangerous work of building a case against a man who had bought the only lawyer in Harlan Creek and likely had the ear of the county seat, then that was a detail that the visible version of events did not need to contain. It was practical. Jesse told himself the same thing with more success than Nora because he had spent years being practical in situations that did not invite it. He knew how to separate what he was doing from what he felt about it. He had been trained in exactly this kind of separation and had practiced it to the point where it was nearly automatic. Nearly. The difficulty was Eli. It was not that the boy was demanding or difficult. He was neither. He was in fact one of the most contained children Jesse had ever encountered. He observed more than he spoke, organized his small world with a thoroughness that was recognizably Thomas's, and had an unsettling ability to ask questions that were more accurate than they appeared. On Jesse's third morning in the barn, Eli appeared at the door with a tin cup of coffee that he had clearly been entrusted to carry without spilling, and set it on the fence post nearest Jesse and said, Mama said to bring you this. She said you take it plain. She's right. Eli considered the concept. How does she know? I had coffee at the table yesterday. She was paying attention. The boy appeared to find this adequate. He sat on the fence rail with his mother's permission. Jesse suspected because he did not seem like a child who acted without coordinates and watched Jesse work on the fence post with an expression of genuine interest that was entirely without the performance of children who wanted to be noticed for being interested. Did you fix fences before? Eli asked. Some. Before you were a surveyor. Jesse paused. He had told the town he was a surveyor. He had not, to his recollection, elaborated on his history to a 6-year-old. What makes you ask that? Eli shrugged with one shoulder. You fix things like you know how they got broken, not just how to fix them. He considered his own observation. Papa fixed things that way. Jesse held the fence post and did not say anything for a moment. The mountain was visible from here, clear in the cold morning air. Your father was a careful man, he said finally. Everyone says that, Eli said. But they say it like it's a small thing. It's not a small thing. No, Jesse agreed. It's not. That was the beginning of it. Not the fence fixing and not the arrangement and not any of the careful practical logic of the situation, but a 6-year-old's accurate observation about careful men delivered from a fence rail in the cold morning air to a man who had spent 3 years learning to be careful enough to make up for the one time he hadn't been. They worked on the ledger at night after Eli was in bed. This was the rhythm they had fallen into without discussing it in the hours before dark. Jesse maintained the cover of ranch work, and Nora maintained the cover of ordinary widowhood, doing the things she always did, the mending, the baking, the trips to town for necessary supplies, during which she performed the careful dignity that was the only armor available to a woman in her position. In the evenings after supper, Eli did his letters at the table, and Jesse sat near the fire with a book he turned pages in, occasionally without reading. And when Eli's eyes grew heavy and Nora carried him to bed, Jesse set down the book and took out his notes, and Nora came back with the ledger, and they worked. It was in the physical terms of what they did simply analysis. Cross-referencing Thomas's numbers with the public records Jesse had obtained, building a timeline, identifying the points where the falsification had occurred and the people whose signatures appeared on the official documents. It was also something else. The first night they worked together, Jesse noticed that Nora approached the ledger the way she approached everything with a precise attention that was rooted in familiarity. She knew her husband's handwriting well enough to read the shorthand he had developed, the private abbreviations of a surveyor who made notes quickly in the field. She translated them for Jesse without being asked, not because he could not have eventually decoded them, but because they were Thomas's and she knew them, and in the knowing there was something that was still living even when the person was not. Jesse watched her trace a notation on the left side of the third page. Her finger did not quite touch the ink. Close enough to feel the impression of it in the paper. Far enough to be careful. This one, she said, means confirmed reading. He used it when he'd measured something twice and got the same number both times. He was cautious about his own instruments. He always double-checked. A pause. He said once that the worst kind of error was the one you were most confident about. Jesse looked at the notation. Thomas Callister had apparently learned from the same school as Jesse the danger of being certain. He was right, Jesse said. Nora looked at him. It was the first time she had looked at him directly in the evening light. The daytime interactions were slightly different, governed by the visibility of them, by the knowledge that Eli was near, and the town could, in theory, observe. In the firelight with the ledger between them, in the snow thick outside, in the late hour making everything quiet, her gray eyes were without calculation, which was the only form of rest a careful person allowed themselves. You sound like you know what it cost, she said. He could have deflected. He was good at deflecting. He had made it an art. I put an innocent man in a cell, he said. I was very confident when I did it. The fire settled. Outside, the wind picked up and found the gaps in the eaves and ran through them. What happened to him? Nora asked. He got out. Jesse said it the way you said things you had rehearsed and found still resistant. 8 months. Witness came forward. He was released. But the 8 months happened, and everything the 8 months cost him. Nora was quiet for a moment. Do you know where he is now? No. It was the truest and most painful answer he had. I wrote a letter I never sent. I told myself it was because there was nothing adequate to say. He paused. Mostly I think it was because I was afraid to know whether he was all right. You could find out. Yes. Are you going to? He looked at the ledger, at Thomas Callister's careful columns, all his double-checked numbers, all his confirmed readings. A man who had been afraid of the error he was most confident about. After this, Jesse said, I'll find out after this. Nora nodded once, which was her way of accepting something without pressing it further. She turned back to the ledger and pointed to the entry for the 4th of July, 1885, 8 months before Thomas died. This is where the numbers diverge most significantly, she said. Whatever happened in early July, that's when the falsification became systematic rather than occasional. Jesse looked where she pointed. That's also, he said slowly, the month Marsh brought in the Denver investors. They looked at each other across the table. He needed the numbers to hold up through the investment round, Nora said. So he made them hold up. And Thomas saw it happen in real time. And Thomas kept writing it down. The fire, the snow, the ledger between them with all its careful entries, all its evidence of a man who had kept writing it down even knowing what it meant. Jesse thought, I have been looking for this for 3 years. He thought I should be thinking about the case. He thought about neither of those things for a moment. He thought about a woman sitting across a table from him at nearly midnight with her husband's ledger under her hands and Thomas's handwriting under her fingers, and the careful steadiness of someone who had been standing alone for 18 months and had not bent. He thought Thomas Callister knew what he had in her. The afternoon of the third Sunday in November, Eli asked about his father. He did not ask often. Nora had noticed this, the careful economy of a child who seemed to understand in some inarticulate way that the question carried weight and that the person he was asking needed to be able to hold that weight without being broken by it. He asked rarely, and when he asked specifically, which was somehow more precise than the general version. This time he asked Jesse. They were in the barn, Jesse mending a piece of harness, Eli watching with the interested attention he brought to most things, and the question arrived the way Eli's questions generally did, without preamble from the middle of whatever he had been thinking about. Was my father brave? Jesse set down the harness. He looked at Eli with the seriousness the question required. What makes you ask? I heard Mr. Deakins say that Papa went back into the mine when he wasn't supposed to, and I heard Mrs. Deakins say that was foolish. But they were different kinds of not supposed to, I think. He was working something out. Brave and foolish are sometimes the same thing, but not always. Jesse thought about Thomas Callister returning to a shaft he knew was being watched, to retrieve evidence he had hidden there, knowing that Marsh had been notified of what he knew. He thought about a man making a calculation, not about whether he would survive it, but about whether the evidence would survive him. Your father was brave, Jesse said. The kind of brave that doesn't announce itself. The kind that's just, he searched for the word. Steady, he did what needed doing because it needed doing, and he didn't make it loud. Eli absorbed this. Like a mountain. Like a mountain, Jesse agreed. Mama says mountains don't move because they're not afraid of being mountains. Your mama is wise. I know. Eli said this with complete matter-of-factness, the way children stated things they had always known. He picked up a piece of leather scrap from the floor and turned it in his hands. Jesse, are you staying? The question had no apparent urgency in it. It was the same tone as all his questions, curious, direct, already half committed to accepting whatever answer came. Jesse looked at the harness in his hands. For now, he said. That means you're not sure. That means I'm not in the habit of making promises I don't know I can keep. Eli considered this. Papa used to say promise is a word that should cost something when you say it. He was right about that too. The barn was warm with the combined heat of 2 horses and the small stove Jesse had going in the corner. Outside, the afternoon light was doing the thing it did in late November in Montana, going golden and final. Very quickly, the day running out faster than seemed fair. If you did stay, Eli said, still turning the leather scrap, I would be okay with that. Jesse did not say anything. I'm just saying, Eli said, and put the leather scrap back on the floor with care, and climbed down from the gate where he had been sitting. Supper's probably soon. He walked out of the barn into the last of the afternoon light, and Jesse sat with the harness and the warmth, and the particular weight of the only honest thing a 6-year-old had offered him, which was not expectation and not demand, but simply the truth of a child who had decided for whatever reason that the truth was safe to say. Jesse hung the harness on the hook and stayed in the barn a little longer than he needed to. It was Nora who found the second thing Thomas had hidden. She found it on a Wednesday, while Jesse was in town maintaining the fiction of his land survey work, and she was cleaning the chimney work that had been deferred since October, because it required climbing a ladder in the cold and was unpleasant even when you had 2 people to do it. She was on the ladder with a brush and a bad temper about the whole enterprise. When the brush caught on something in the upper flue, something that had no reason to be in a chimney flue, and she pulled it, and a second oilcloth packet came down with a quantity of soot and left her on the ladder blinking and black-handed and holding something she had not expected. She climbed down and set the packet on the kitchen table and sat in front of it for 3 minutes before she opened it. Inside 6 pages of Thomas's handwriting folded close. Not a ledger entry, not survey numbers. A letter, or rather not a letter, but something more like a deposition, organized by date and witness and fact in the careful language of a man who had understood that what he was writing might eventually need to stand up in front of someone who required precision. It began, I am Thomas Callister, mine surveyor, employed by the Marsh Creek Mining Company since March of 1883. I am writing this because I believe I will not be alive to speak it. Nora sat at the kitchen table and read 6 pages that Thomas had written in the last month of his life. He had known by then with certainty. He described the conversation with Marsh in October. Marsh had come to him directly, had been almost gentle about it, the way powerful men could afford to be gentle with the people they were about to destroy. He had offered Thomas a choice stop documenting, take a financial arrangement for his silence, and move his family out of Harlan Creek within the month, or continue and face consequences that Marsh had not specified but had made legible through implication in the quality of his stillness. Thomas had said he would consider it. He had spent 3 days considering. He had written it all down, what he would lose by running, what he would leave behind if he ran. Not for himself, he was clear about that. He wrote, I am not afraid for myself. I am afraid of what running teaches my son. I am afraid of what it means for Eli to grow up knowing his father saw a wrong thing and moved aside from it. He had decided to stay, not because he believed he could survive it. He was clear about that too. He wrote, I do not expect to survive this. Marsh is not a man who leaves accounts open. I am staying because the evidence I have gathered can only reach the right hands if I am here to make sure it is complete. The ledger is under the north corner of the kitchen floor. This letter is in the chimney flue. There is a third thing I have sent to a man I trust. A third thing. Nora read that sentence 4 times. Then she kept reading and found the name of the man Thomas had trusted. When Jessie returned that evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the 6 pages in front of her and soot still on her hands that she had not noticed. She looked up when he came in and said, he wrote everything down, not just the numbers. Everything, why he stayed, what he was thinking. Her voice was level in the way that it was level when it was costing her the most. He didn't tell me because he didn't want me to try to stop him. Jessie sat down slowly. He knew I would have tried to stop him, she said. He was right. I would have. She looked at the pages. He was protecting me from knowing, because knowing would have made me more afraid and less safe. A pause. I spent 18 months being angry at him for a debt he didn't owe, in a silence I didn't understand. You didn't know, Jessie said. No. She was quiet for a moment. He says there's a third piece of evidence, that he sent it to someone he trusted. Someone named Riordan. Jessie went very still. Patrick Riordan, a U.S. deputy marshal out of Helena who had been quietly tracking Marsh since the Colorado situation and had asked Jessie through a mutual contact to gather what he could before moving. Riordan, who had told Jessie in their last communication that he was waiting on documentation that could stand up in a territorial court. Thomas Callister had sent evidence directly to the one person who could use it. Thomas Callister had known exactly what he was doing. You know that name, Nora said. It was not a question. Yes. He looked at her. I know who Riordan is, and I know what Thomas sending him evidence means for the case against Marsh. Tell me, he told her. Not everything, not the Colorado story, not Franklin Greer, not the full weight of his own history with Marsh's pattern of destruction, but the functional truth that Patrick Riordan was coming, that Thomas's evidence, combined with the ledger and the deposition, was enough to make an arrest that would hold that Marsh's access to the local law would not protect him against a federal marshal with a documented case. When Jessie finished, Nora sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, Thomas was building this from the outside, and you were building it from the outside, and he sent his piece to the person who could connect it to yours. She looked at the deposition pages. He was smart. Jessie said, he was smarter than I sometimes gave him credit for. She said this without self-punishment, just the honest accounting of a person examining their assumptions. I thought he was steady and careful and good. I don't think I thought he was strategic. Being strategic and being good are not incompatible. She looked at him. No, they're not. A pause. Are you good, Jessie? It was the first time she had used his name without the formality of his last name attached. He did not think she had noticed. I'm trying to be, he said. It's not the same as already being. She picked up one of the pages and held it with both hands carefully the way she had not quite touched the ledger's ink. He says at the end of the letter, Nora will be all right. She always lands on her feet. I have never in my life met anyone who lands on their feet the way she does. Her voice caught briefly on the last line. I didn't know he thought that. He would have told you, Jesse said, if he'd had more time. She set the page down. She looked at the fire. She stayed quiet for long enough that Jesse understood she needed the silence to do the work that words couldn't, and he did not fill it. When she looked up again, her eyes were dry. What do we do now? We get word to Reardon. We tell him we have the ledger and the deposition. We arrange a time and a meeting point. He paused. It needs to happen before Marsh decides to move. The eviction notice gives him legal grounds for a confrontation, and if he knows the deadline is approaching without compliance, he might not wait for the courts. No. Nora looked at the soot on her hands. Decker, she said, the foreman. I've seen how he drinks on Wednesday nights. A man who drinks that way is carrying something. Jesse looked at her. I've noticed the same thing. You said you were good at talking to people who were carrying things. I said I was trying to be good. Close enough, Nora said, and stood up and went to wash the soot from her hands. And Jesse thought that Thomas Callister had been a man who understood exactly what he had. The tap on Jesse's barn door came at midnight on a Thursday. He was awake, he was often awake, at that hour, which was one of the long-running costs of the work, and he opened the door to find Reverend Aldous Cole standing in the November dark with no hat on his head, and the expression of a man who had been arguing with himself for a long time and had finally arrived at a resolution he was not entirely at peace with. Cole was 60 or looked at a thin man, tall with a face organized by decades of performing authority, and the recent visible strain of something undermining it from within. He was carrying a small lantern that he held close to his chest as if it were a warming thing rather than a light. Jesse stepped back from the door. Cole came in. I'm not here for what you think, Cole said before Jesse could speak. I don't know yet what I think, Jesse said, which was partly true. Cole set the lantern on the post and stood in the middle of the barn with his hands at his sides. I witnessed the accident report, and he said. Marsh asked me. I did it as a favor. I told myself it was just a document, that the accident had happened, that the paperwork needed witnesses, that being present didn't mean being responsible. He stopped. I knew it wasn't an accident. Jesse waited. I saw Decker the evening before. I saw what Decker's face looked like. A man who has just done something or is about to do something does not look that way over paperwork. Cole's hands moved a small helpless gesture. I told myself it wasn't my evidence to speak to. I told myself there was no certainty. I told myself a dozen things. They were all true in the way that useful untruths are true. Why are you here now? Jesse asked. Cole's face changed. The authority went out of it not all at once, but in stages like a lamp turned down. Because Marsh came to me yesterday. He's had a hold on me, a piece of information about my past that he's used to keep me quiet and cooperative. He reminded me of it yesterday and told me that if the widow didn't vacate within the deadline, he would need my assistance with certain documents and certain testimony. He paused. He said the words in the gentle way, the way that means there is no choice in what he is asking. And instead of cooperating, Jesse said, you came here. I came here because... Cole stopped. He looked at the lantern. Because cooperating further would require me to provide false testimony about an inquest. And because I am old enough and frightened enough to understand that there are things you can do that close off other options entirely, and that is one of them. He looked up. I know what Marsh has done. I know Decker was involved in Thomas Callister's death. I am willing to say that to the appropriate authority. Not for purely clean reasons, Jesse said. Not accusatory, just naming it. Cole's jaw tightened. No, not for purely clean reasons. Marsh is about to use me to destroy a woman and a child, and that is something I can prevent by coming forward. I would prefer to claim that my conscience arrived here independently. I don't think you would believe that. Probably not, but the testimony is still testimony. Yes, Jesse said, it is. Cole stood in the barn with his hands at his sides and his face showing the particular relief of a man who has confessed something and is waiting to find out what it costs. It was not a comfortable relief. It was not going to become comfortable. But it was relief. Marsh's hold on you, Jesse said. What is it? Cole was quiet for a moment, then, I have a daughter. She doesn't know I'm her father. Her mother and I, it was a long time ago before I was ordained, before I came here. I was not a good man in the way that young men are often not good men when they are given the opportunity to be otherwise. He said it plainly without self-dramatization. Marsh found out somehow. He's had the information for 2 years. Jesse looked at him. I'm not asking for absolution, Cole said. I'm explaining the mechanics. I understand the mechanics. Jesse had in his time seen this particular mechanics many times. A man compromised by a piece of private truth held by someone who had understood the value of private truths as currency. Cole was not innocent. He was also not the worst thing in this situation. If you testify, Marsh will use it. I know. Your congregation will know. I know that too. Cole picked up his lantern. I have a daughter I've never introduced myself to. The least I can do is make sure she lives in a county where the same man who ruined Thomas Callister can't keep doing it. He left before Jesse could say anything further, walking out into the dark with his lantern and his impure conscience, and the decision he had arrived at for the right reason in the wrong way, which was Jesse thought still a decision made. Jesse stood in the barn for a long time after. 3 pieces of evidence: the ledger, Thomas's deposition, Reardon with whatever Thomas had sent him. Now a witness, Decker, Cole had said. Decker was the direct witness. Decker was the one who knew what had happened in the secondary shaft. Jesse thought about a man who drank alone on Wednesday nights with the focused efficiency of someone performing a necessary function. He thought about a man carrying something that got heavier every year. He thought sometimes people confess not because they've decided to, but because they've been waiting for someone to notice the weight. He sent a message to Reardon the next morning. The conversation with Decker happened on a Wednesday mid-December in the saloon after the other patrons had thinned out. Jesse did not approach it as an interrogation. He had done that before, had perfected the professional techniques of information extraction, the calibrated questions, the strategic silences, the management of a subject toward disclosure. He had been good at it. He had been very good at it in Colorado with Franklin Greer, and he knew exactly how much his being good at it was worth. He sat near Decker and ordered a coffee and did not ask any questions at all. Decker noticed him. Decker noticed everything in the particular way of a man whose survival instincts were currently in conflict with his conscience, and who was therefore running hot on all his instruments. He looked at Jesse sidelong twice before he spoke. "You're the surveyor." "That's right. You've been at the Callister place." Jesse said nothing. Decker looked at his glass. "She's a good woman." The widow. He said it to the glass, not to Jesse. Thomas was a decent man. "I've gathered that." Silence. The fire in the corner, the occasional sound of the street outside. "A man does things," Decker said still to the glass, "when he's told to do them. When he's got a wife and 2 kids, and a man like Marsh is the only one who knows about something from 10 years back. That..." He stopped. He turned the glass in his hands. "It doesn't matter what it was. The point is, you do the thing and then you spend however long afterward doing the only thing you can do about it." He picked up the glass and drank without tasting it. Jesse said, "The thing you did, was it the kind of thing someone else knew about?" Decker set the glass down very carefully. "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you were alone." Decker looked at him for the first time directly. He had the eyes of someone who had not slept well in 18 months. "No," he said, "I was not alone." "The other person is willing to talk," Jesse said. He did not say Cole's name. He did not need to. Decker looked at the bar for a long time. Jesse let the silence do what he had learned too late and too expensively in Colorado to let silence do, which was to hold the space that needed holding without trying to fill it with certainty. When Decker spoke again, his voice was flat and quiet and entirely without drama. "What do you need?" "A statement. Written. What happened in the secondary shaft on the 14th of February, 1885. And then you give it to a federal marshal, and then it's in someone else's hands." Decker looked at his glass. "It won't fix it," Jesse said. "No." Decker had no illusions about this. "But it stops the bleeding." He wrote the statement that night at the bar in Ott's handwriting because Ott had agreed without comment to the use of his pen and paper and his silence, which Jesse had learned was the most reliable currency in any small town, the quiet agreement of a person who had seen enough to know what mattered. Jesse walked home in the cold dark with Decker's statement in his coat pocket, and Cole's testimony, and Thomas's ledger, and Thomas's deposition, and he thought about a man who had gone back into a shaft knowing what he was walking into, and he thought about a woman who had been standing alone for 18 months without knowing why, and he thought about a boy who arranged stones into mountains on the floor of his father's cabin. He stopped at the edge of the property and looked at the dark shape of the cabin against the winter sky and the single lamp still lit in the kitchen window, which meant Nora was awake waiting not because she was anxious, but because she had always made her own decisions about when to sleep. The letter she had found in Thomas's coat. I chose because of you and Eli, not to leave you, to make sure that when the leaving comes, you will still be standing. She was standing. He went inside. Patrick Reardon arrived on a Tuesday 4 days before the eviction deadline. He came in the manner of men who did not want to announce themselves on a livery horse in trail clothes entering town at the unremarkable hour of mid-morning when people were occupied with their own business. He was a large man, deliberate in his movements, with a face that gave nothing away and eyes that took everything in. He registered at the Territorial under a name that was not his and sent Jesse a note through Ott at the saloon with 3 words: found a room. They met that evening at the saloon in the back corner, like men having an ordinary conversation about nothing in particular. Jesse had not seen Reardon in a year. The year had not changed him in any visible way, which was either a sign of exceptional self-containment or an indication that Reardon simply did not register the passage of time in his face the way ordinary people did. "What Thomas Callister sent me," Reardon said, after they had ordered and the barkeep had moved away, "is a signed statement dated October 15th, 1884. 1 year before he died, Marsh came to him directly in September of that year, offered him the arrangement. Thomas spent a month deciding and sent me this before he made his answer." He set a folded paper on the table. It names Marsh. It names the scheme. It names Decker as Marsh's operational instrument. It was witnessed by an attorney in Missoula. Jesse looked at the paper. "He had it witnessed in Missoula," Reardon said. "Drove 4 hours to do it, because he knew any attorney in Harlan Creek was in Marsh's orbit." Thomas Callister. Jesse thought about that drive. 4 hours each way in October, leaving before light, returning after dark, probably telling Nora he had survey work near the county line. 4 hours each direction in a witness document, and then the long drive home, knowing what he had started and what it was likely to finish. "Combined with what you have," Jesse said, "it's enough." Reardon said this with the flat certainty of a man who had spent 20 years assessing what was enough. "More than enough. The ledger proves the fraud. The deposition proves he knew the danger. This statement proves he documented it a year before his death." He paused. "Cole's testimony and Decker's statement established the murder." "It was murder," Jesse said. "The roof collapse in the secondary shaft was induced. Decker confirmed it. There was no structural failure. It was a controlled collapse arranged when Thomas was alone in the shaft." Reardon said this without softening. He was not the kind of man who softened things. "Marsh ordered it. Decker executed it." Jesse had known this in the way you knew things you had been building toward for weeks. Knowing it as a confirmed fact was different. It sat in his chest differently. "What's the timeline?" he asked. "I arrest Marsh tomorrow morning." Reardon set his coffee down. "I'll have county deputies to assist. I'm telling you the time because you need to make sure the widow and the boy, they are not at the cabin when I move on Marsh. He may have men who act independently when he's taken. He might move tonight." "That's possible." Reardon looked at him steadily. "I've arranged for a deputy to watch the property tonight, but I'd rather you were there." Jesse looked at the table. "She trusts you," Reardon said. It was not a question and not an observation about anything other than logistics. "Yes, then be there." Jesse walked back to the cabin in the cold December dark and told Nora. She listened without interrupting. This was he had learned how she received information that required processing completely silently, letting it arrive whole before she began to work with it. When he finished, she said, "Tomorrow morning." Yes, Eli was asleep. The cabin was quiet. The lamp on the table put a warm circle of light that ended before it reached the walls, leaving the edges of the room in shadow. "He ordered it," she said, not a question, testing the sentence to see how it held. "Yes." And Thomas knew in October of 1884 what was likely coming, and drove to Missoula to make sure there was a witness. She looked at the lamp, and came home and built the floor in the kitchen that November. I remember he was very particular about it, more than made sense for floorboards. A pause. He was putting the ledger under it. Almost certainly. He was in November. He was already. She stopped. Something moved across her face that Jesse had not seen before. Not grief, not anger, something older and more complicated. Love and grief and anger braided together into something that had no single name. "I was complaining about the cold that month. The floorboards were taking too long, and the kitchen was cold because we'd pulled them up, and I was irritated with him about it." Her voice did not break. She would not let it break. "I was irritated about floorboards while he was—" "Nora, I know." She looked up. "I know it doesn't help to count the things I didn't understand. I know." She pressed both hands flat on the table. "I just need a moment to be angry. Take it, Jessie said. She was angry for exactly as long as she needed to be. It looked from the outside like stillness. She sat at the table with her hands flat and her eyes on the lamp and her jaw set. But it was not stillness. It was the specific, concentrated work of feeling something fully and then deciding what to do with it. Jessie had seen her do this before with smaller versions of the same work. He had come to have a profound respect for the process. When she looked up again, her eyes were clear. What do we do until morning? Nothing changes tonight. Reardon has a deputy on the property. We stay inside with Eli. He paused. In the morning before Reardon moves, you take Eli to the Breck house. Mrs. Breck has agreed to have him for the morning. She agreed to that. She's one of the people in this town who has been waiting for someone to ask her to do the right thing, Jessie said. There are more of them than Marsh has accounted for. Nora absorbed this. She had thought for 18 months that the town was uniformly against her. It was, Jessie had learned in his weeks here, more complicated than that. Harlan Creek was not full of bad people. It was full of people who had made the calculations that frightened people make, who to stand with, what to risk, when the cost of acting was higher than the cost of looking away. Those calculations were cowardly, but cowardice was not the same as malice. And cowardice was reversible when someone made it safe enough to reverse. All right, Nora said. They stayed up. Not working, the working was done. They sat at the table and Nora poured coffee, and Jessie thought of things to say and said almost none of them because what the situation asked for was not talking, but presence. He had learned slowly and imperfectly that presence was sometimes more useful than words, that sitting in the same room as someone while they moved through something difficult was itself a form of help, that you did not need to solve the thing to be useful in proximity to it. Nora seemed to understand this. She did not fill the silence with things she did not mean. She was good at silence in the way that people who had spent time truly alone were good at it, not because she had run out of things to say, but because she was selective about when words were the right tool. At some point, past midnight, she said, "You said you were trying to be good." Jessie looked up from the fire. "I've been thinking about that." She held her coffee with both hands. "Trying implies you're not sure you are, but I don't think that's the same as not being it." She looked at him. "You came to a town where a man was hurting people. You stayed when you had every reason to leave. She stopped. "You told my son true things about his father. You didn't try to be his father. You just told him true things." Her voice was careful in the way it was careful when she was saying something that cost something. "That's what good looks like, Jessie. It's not a feeling, it's a series of choices." He did not say anything for a moment. "Thomas made those choices," he said. "I'm trying to make them. There's a difference. There's less difference than you think." She set down her coffee. "Thomas made those choices and was afraid the whole time. He said it in the deposition. He was afraid every day. Being afraid and making the choices anyway is the whole thing. That's all it is." Jessie looked at the fire. "Whatever happened in Colorado," she said, "you made a mistake, a serious one that cost someone something real. And then you spent 3 years trying to be more careful." She paused. "That's not a story about a bad man. That's a story about a man who took his mistakes seriously enough to change." He thought of Franklin Greer. He thought of the letter he had never sent. He thought of the things she had said weeks ago you could find out after this. After this, he said, "I'm going to write that letter." "Good." She said it simply like a fact that had always been true. They sat by the fire until the first gray light of December morning began to show under the door. Then Nora got up to wake Eli. Jessie walked Nora and Eli to the Breck house at 7 in the morning. Mrs. Breck, a stout woman in her 50s, with the practical efficiency of someone who had made a decision and intended to execute it without drama, opened the door before they knocked and ushered Eli inside with a plate of cornbread. Eli went without protest, distracted by the cornbread and by the Breck family's enormous orange cat, which regarded him with the cautious interest that cats extend toward children who might be useful. Jessie walked back toward the center of town. He was halfway down the main street when he saw him. The man was standing across from the general store in a doorway that was not his doorway, wearing a coat Jessie had seen twice before, once in Denver and once in Chicago. He had the posture of a man waiting and the stillness of a man who was very good at waiting, and he was looking at Jessie with the expression of someone who had been watching a subject and had just been noticed. Connor Briggs. Jessie had worked with Briggs for 4 years at the Pinkerton Agency. He had trusted Briggs in the way you trusted people you worked alongside completely and practically, and without examining whether the trust was built on substance or on proximity. He had, after leaving the agency, stayed in contact, the way former colleagues stayed in contact occasionally without intensity through the informal channels of men in adjacent lines of work. He had sent Briggs a brief communication 3 weeks ago. Not an explanation, just a mention that he was in Harlan Creek working a land dispute matter. A routine contact, the kind he made periodically. He understood, looking at Briggs in the doorway of a store he had no reason to be standing in front of, that the contact had not been routine. Jesse did not change his pace. He did not look away. He walked toward Briggs with the same measured stride he had been using, and Briggs watched him come, and neither of them spoke until Jesse was close enough that speech was not carrying. "You're here early," Jesse said. Briggs said, "Marsh paid better than I expected." It was the simplest version of the confession. No preamble, no justification, no attempt to make it into a misunderstanding. Briggs had always been direct, which was one of the reasons Jesse had trusted him. He was direct now, too, which was, Jesse thought, with a dim and distant recognition, one of the most disorienting forms of betrayal, when the quality that made a person trustworthy became the mechanism of the damage. "How long?" Jesse said. 3 years. Briggs's face was a thing to observe, not without feeling, but with feeling that had been managed into something that looked like detachment. "Colorado. When you went to Colorado chasing Marsh, I was already on his payroll. When you started to build the case against Greer, I helped it along." Jesse heard this. He heard it the way you heard things that explained a great deal, that filled in shapes you had always felt the absence of, but had attributed to your own failures of perception. The mismatched evidence. The way certain things had resolved so neatly. The feeling afterward that the case had been too easy. It had been too easy, because someone had been making it easy. "Franklin Greer," Jesse said, "was not involved with Marsh." Briggs did not flinch from this. "I constructed the association. You followed it. Greer was collateral damage that I thought would resolve itself quickly. It didn't resolve itself quickly. 8 months, a man's house, his wife, his standing in his community. 8 months, and then freedom that came too late to give back what had been taken." Jesse had spent 3 years believing that the failure had been his, that he had been too confident, too quick, too certain, that his professional pride had made him careless. He had been careless, but the error had been constructed for him by someone he trusted for money. He stood in the cold December street and felt the architecture of the last 3 years rearrange itself around this new weight-bearing fact. The guilt was not gone. He had still followed the false evidence. He had still been the instrument. But the shape of it was different, and different shapes had different meanings, and he was not sure what to do with the meaning yet. Later. He would do something with the meaning later. "Why tell me now?" he asked. "Because Marsh told me last night he wants the widow dealt with before Riordan can move." Briggs said it with the flatness of a man who has made a series of calculations and arrived at an unpleasant answer. "And because dealing with a woman and a child is where I stop." "Where you stop," Jesse said. "I know what I've done." Briggs's voice did not waver. "I know what I am. I'm telling you because it's what I can do from where I am, and because you deserve to know about Greer." "Does Marsh know you're here?" "He thinks I'm on my way to the cabin." Jesse looked at him for a long time. The street was quiet. The mountain was visible at the edge of town. Riordan would be moving in less than an hour. "Are you willing to tell Riordan what you told me?" Jesse said, "including Colorado." Briggs looked at the mountain too. "Yes." Jesse thought about Franklin Greer. He thought about the letter he had promised to write. He thought about all the careful things you did after a mistake to make sure the accounting was as complete as possible, because you could not undo the mistake, but you could insist on the full ledger. Thomas Callister had understood that, had spent a year making sure the full ledger existed. "Come with me," Jesse said. They walked toward the Territorial Hotel where Riordan was preparing to move, and Jesse thought about mistakes that had been constructed by other people and carried by yourself as if they were yours alone, and about the particular relief of finding out that the weight you had been carrying was not entirely what you thought it was. Not relief that diminished the damage, but relief that clarified the shape of it. Clarified shapes were easier to carry than shapeless ones. Denton Marsh was arrested at 8:47 in the morning. He was at his desk in the mine office when Riordan came through the door with 2 county deputies, and whatever Marsh had expected this Tuesday to hold, it was apparently not this, because for one unguarded moment, the careful surface of him cracked, and what showed beneath was not the cool certainty of a powerful man, but the animal awareness of something that has been cornered. It passed quickly. By the time Reardon presented the warrant, Marsh had reassembled his composure into something that looked like dignity and was in fact the performance of it. He said to no one in particular that this was a mistake and that his lawyer would correct it within the week. Prewitt, his lawyer, was in the county seat when the telegram arrived, informing him that his employer had been arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. Prewitt reportedly sat down in his chair and did not move for quite some time. Decker was arrested at the mine 2 hours later. He went without resistance with the particular exhaustion of a man for whom the act of being arrested is less tiring than the act of waiting to be arrested. He confirmed everything in the statement he had written in Ott's bar, and then he confirmed it again in writing for Reardon, and then he sat in the county jail and appeared witnesses said to sleep for the first time in recent memory. Reverend Paul was not arrested. He was asked to give his testimony to a territorial judge, which he did in detail and in full, including the information about Marsh's hold over him, the daughter he had never acknowledged the secret that had been used as a leash for 2 years. The testimony was admitted. The daughter, as it later came out, had been living 60 miles away in Great Falls and had not known her father's name. Whether she would eventually want to was a question the future held and the present could not answer. Briggs's statement regarding the Colorado investigation opened an inquiry that would take 8 months to complete. At the conclusion of that inquiry, the conviction of Franklin Greer would be formally vacated. It had already been vacated de facto by the new evidence that had emerged before Jesse left the agency, but the formal record had not been corrected. The correction of the formal record was not the same as restoring what had been taken, but it was the record being made accurate, and accurate records were what careful people had instead of miracles. Jesse learned about the vacation of Greer's conviction from a letter Reardon sent him 3 months later, forwarded from the Territorial Hotel in Harlan Creek, to an address that was by then something other than temporary. He read it twice. Then he sat down and wrote the letter he had been revising in his head for 3 years. He wrote it simply and without performance, the way Thomas Callister had written his deposition, as a clear account of what he knew and what he had done and what he was sorry for. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not think that was his to ask for. He stated the facts, and he stated his responsibility for the part of them that was his, and he gave Franklin Greer the address he could be reached at in case Greer ever wanted to respond. He sent it. Whether he received an answer is a different story, and perhaps not this one's to tell. 3 days after Marsh's arrest, when the immediate noise of the event had settled into the lower register of consequences, lawyers and depositions in the slow machinery of territorial law, Nora found one more thing. She found it because she was cleaning with the thoroughness of a woman clearing a space not just of dirt, but of something else, the weight of danger, the accumulated tension of weeks of careful concealment, the particular staleness that a house acquires when its inhabitants have been afraid in it. She was cleaning the kitchen with more energy than the kitchen strictly required when she noticed in the corner of the window frame, the kitchen window that faced north toward the mountain, something wedged into the gap between the frame and the wall. A folded piece of paper, small, tucked precisely into the gap the way you would tuck something if you needed it to stay, but also needed it to be findable. She brought it to the table and unfolded it. It was Thomas's handwriting, but different from the ledger, different from the deposition, smaller, more private, less organized. It was a list. At the top in his hand for after. Below it, a list of 7 items. Some were practical, the location of a small savings account she had not known about in a bank in Missoula. A note about the deed to the property which was in his name, but had a clause she had overlooked regarding transfer to a surviving spouse. A name of a man in Helena who had worked with him on early surveys and who Thomas described as a good man who can speak to your character in legal proceedings if needed. The last 2 items were not practical. The 6th item read, "Tell Eli his father was afraid. That being afraid and staying is the whole of courage. He will need to know this." The 7th item read, "If you find someone who stays, let him." 4 words. After everything. After the ledger and the deposition and the witness document and the floorboard and the chimney and all the careful, methodical work of a man building a defense for people he would not be there to defend. If you find someone who stays, let him. Nora sat at the kitchen table with this piece of paper for a long time. Outside, she could hear Jesse and Eli in the yard. Jesse was teaching Eli to identify bird tracks in the snow. She had been able to hear this conversation for 10 minutes, Eli's questions and Jesse's patient, accurate answers, and the sound of both of them moving around the yard with the easy economy of people who had become comfortable in each other's company. She heard Eli say, Jesse, a mountain doesn't move because it's not afraid of being a mountain. She heard Jesse say, your mother told you that. She says things that sound simple, and then you think about them and they're not simple. I've noticed that, Jesse said. A pause. Then Eli with the directness he brought to everything. Are you going to stay now? Jesse's answer came without hesitation, which was the only way that answer would have meant what it meant. Yes. Good, Eli said, and apparently returned to the bird tracks because the next thing Nora heard was another question about whether a particular bird was the kind that came back in spring or the kind that stayed all winter. Nora folded the paper and held it against her chest for a moment, the way you held something that was simultaneously a grief and a permission. Then she set it inside the cedar box next to the letter she had found in Thomas's coat 18 months ago, and she went outside. The yard was cold and bright in the December afternoon. The snow untouched except for the trail of small footprints and larger footprints moving around the edge of the property. Jesse looked up when she appeared at the door. Eli crouched over something and the snow did not. Jesse, Eli said, still crouched. This one is a robin. Robins come back, Jesse said. They do, Nora said. She came down the steps. Jesse was watching her with the attention he gave to things that required careful observation, not the professional assessment he had applied to everyone when he first arrived, which had been slightly exhausting to be on the receiving end of, but something quieter and more personal, which was its own kind of attention, and she had stopped minding it. I found something, she said. He waited. A list. Thomas left a list. She looked at him. The mountain was visible over his shoulder, the same mountain that had been there for all of this. The last thing on it was 4 words. Jesse said nothing. If you find someone who stays, she said, let him. The yard was very quiet. Eli had found something else in the snow that required examination and had moved a little further along the fence line, absorbed in the investigation of the small world at his feet. Jesse looked at her. I'm not going to make a speech about it, Nora said. I'm not good at speeches, and I don't think you need one. She held his gaze. But I want you to know that I know the difference between staying because you have nowhere to go and staying because you've decided. Thomas stayed because he decided. She paused. I want to know if that's what this is. Jesse thought about the barn door and the saddlebags he had not moved, about Eli on the fence rail asking questions, about midnight conversations and ledgers and the way she folded things she needed to keep. That's what it is, he said. She nodded, which was her way of accepting something fully. Good. She went back inside to start supper. Jesse stood in the yard for a moment longer looking at the mountain. Then he followed her in. Eli from the fence called after him, Jesse, I think the robin track goes all the way to the barn. We'll look at it tomorrow, Jesse said. And the day after, and the day after. Eli appeared satisfied by this. He went back to his investigation and Jesse went inside, and the smoke began to rise from the chimney and the mountain did not move. The letter came in March. Spring was early that year. The creek had begun to run free in the last week of February, and the south face of the hillside behind the cabin was already showing the first tentative green of the new season. Jesse had been sleeping under the Callister roof since January, in the small room off the kitchen, and the town had spent approximately 3 weeks discussing this before largely running out of the energy required to maintain disapproval of 2 people who had done nothing particularly disapprovable and who had additionally been the direct cause of the removal from power of a man whose removal many people had privately wanted for years. The letter was addressed to Jesse Vane, care of the Harlan Creek Post, which Ott was informally managing until the territorial postal system got around to assigning a proper postmaster. Jesse opened it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning in March, while Nora was in the yard with Eli and the chickens. They had acquired 3 through a transaction involving a man passing through who owed Ott money, and Eli had named them with a thoroughness that made them impossible to ever consider practical. The letter was from Franklin Greer. It was not a long letter. Franklin Greer was, it emerged, not a man who used many words. He was also, Jesse learned from the letter, alive and residing in the town of Dillon, Montana, where he had obtained work as a carpenter and had recently 6 months ago been married for the second time to a woman named Clara, who had 2 children from her first marriage and who Greer described in the understated way of a man who chose words like he chose timber as good. The letter said, I received yours. I'm not going to tell you it was nothing because it wasn't nothing, and I don't think you want me to tell you that anyway. I'm going to tell you that it was 8 months, that I lost things that I haven't gotten back, that I'm also still here, which I wasn't sure about for a while. I think you know what that means. There's a woman here who thinks I'm worth something, which is most of what a man needs. I'm writing back because you asked and because it seemed like the kind of letter a man should get an answer to. It was signed F. Greer. There was a postscript, don't bother with the sorry anymore. You already said it. The next thing is just to keep going. Jesse read the letter twice. Then he set it on the table and sat with it. He thought about what the next thing was. Nora came in from the yard with cold air and a chicken-related complaint about Eli's naming conventions and stopped when she saw Jesse's face. She looked at the letter. She looked at him. Is it from Greer? Yes. She sat down across the table. Is he all right? Jesse thought about it. A man in Dillon with a carpenter's work and a woman who thought he was worth something. 8 months he hadn't got his back in a second marriage and a postscript about not bothering with sorry anymore. He's alive, Jesse said. He's got a life. He looked at the letter. He says the next thing is to just keep going. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he's right. I know. You've been carrying this for 3 years. I know. You can still carry it. She said this carefully without the romantic implication that forgiveness resolved everything. You should carry it. People who did things that cost other people something should carry some of the weight of that. But there's a difference between carrying it and being crushed by it. Jesse looked at her. Thomas carried things, she said. I know that now. He carried the knowledge of what was coming for a year, and he didn't crumple under it. He just kept going and doing the work. She looked at the letter. Greer's telling you the same thing. The work from here is just being here, doing the right thing with what's left. Jesse folded the letter carefully. He set it in his coat pocket. He looked at the woman across the table from him. The woman who had been standing alone for 18 months and who had, without making it an announcement, allowed someone else to stand beside her, who had read her dead husband's final instruction, if you find someone who stays, let him, and had done exactly that with the same practicality and directness with which she did everything else. I'd like to stay, he said, saying it clearly because she had asked for clarity and because she deserved it and because clear statements were a form of respect. I know, she said. I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment with the gray eyes that were the color of held decisions, and then the decision resolved, and she said yes. It was not the most elaborate proposal in the history of the Montana Territory. It was on its face a very plain thing, a man and a woman at a kitchen table in March, snow still on the mountain spring in the yard. Eli outside with 3 badly named chickens. Smoke rising from the chimney. A letter from a man who had learned to keep going in Jesse's coat pocket. But proposals are not measured by their elaborateness. They are measured by what they cost the person making them, by how much of the interior map they reveal, by how fully the person making them is standing in what they're saying. Jesse was fully in it. Nora knew. They were married in April when the snow was mostly gone except on the high peaks, which held their white all year, and would hold it long after any of them were there to see it. The ceremony was simple and deliberate, which was how both of them preferred things. A traveling minister, a man who had been doing frontier marriages for 30 years and asked no questions beyond whether the 2 people in front of him had made a genuine decision. He had a talent for telling the minister, and he looked at Jesse and Nora for approximately 30 seconds before concluding that they had. Eli stood between them in his good shirt, with his hair combed in the way he allowed only for serious occasions, holding a wildflower bouquet he had assembled himself from the early spring growth along the creek. He had strong opinions about which flowers were appropriate and had curated the selection with a care that suggested he was taking this seriously. The minister said, "Marriage is not about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone you're willing to be imperfect with, someone whose imperfections don't frighten you, someone you'd rather argue with than agree with someone else." He had clearly said this many times and meant it every time. Do you, in full knowledge of each other's imperfections, choose this? Jesse said yes. Nora said yes. Eli, who had not been asked but felt the question included him, said yes, too, with the solemnity of a child who had understood what was being decided. The minister smiled. The ring Jesse placed on Nora's hand was not a fancy thing, plain silver shaped at the Harlan Creek blacksmith shop by a man named Porter, who had, on being told the purpose, charged half his usual rate and insisted on buffing it himself with a cloth he kept for special occasions. Nora wore it the way she wore everything she chose as something that was hers. Afterward, there was a meal. Mrs. Breck had organized it in the way that organized women organize things comprehensively and without waiting to be asked, and half the town came. Not all of them had been warm to Nora during the long 18 months. Some of them had been actively cold. They came anyway, and they brought food, and they did not make speeches. And there is a kind of reconciliation that happens not through words, but through the simple act of showing up and setting a dish on someone's table and sitting down at it. It is not the same as never having been cold, but it is the next thing after that, and next things are what you have. Aunt came and brought a bottle he said was for exceptional occasions. Jesse did not ask the provenance. Sheriff Delman came, which surprised some people, and probably shouldn't have. Delman had been decent the whole time in the way that decent men are sometimes decent quietly and ineffectively, and the recent events had given him something to be decent about that was public and useful. Decker did not come. He was in a county facility awaiting trial. But there was word through the channels that carried word in small towns that he had made a statement to the effect that he was glad the right thing had eventually happened. Whether that was true or whether it was the kind of thing men said to feel better about themselves, no one could verify. It went into the general ledger of things that were probably partly true and would have to be enough. Reverend Cole did not come either. He had left Harlan Creek after his testimony by mutual agreement with his congregation, which had handled the situation with more grace than it might have. He went to Great Falls. Whether he eventually found his daughter and whether she wanted to be found were questions that the future held. The party wound down as parties in small towns do, slowly, gracefully, in the particular way of communities that have been through something together and are not sure yet what the something means, but know it will mean more over time. Jesse and Nora sat on the porch after Eli had been put to bed in the quiet that was left when the last of the neighbors had gone. The mountain was dark against the April sky, its high snow catching the last light. The creek could be heard from here running fast with snow melt. "He'd want us happy," Nora said. She was talking about Thomas. She did not have to say his name. "I know," Jesse said. "That's not a small thing to say, wanting someone's widow to be happy." She looked at the mountain. "It means he understood that his decision, his choice to stay, to do what he did, it wasn't meant to haunt me. It was meant to free me. Yes, I was haunted anyway, for 18 months. You're allowed." "I know I'm allowed." She leaned back in the chair. "I'm just saying it's over now. The haunting. I can carry the memory without being haunted by it." She paused. "There's a difference." Jesse understood this. He thought about his own carried things, Franklin Greer's letter in his coat pocket. The case now formally closed, the full accounting as complete as it would ever be. 3 years of guilt that had not been dissolved but had been clarified, made the right shape, possible to carry without being crushed. "My daughter calls me Papa now," he said. He meant Eli. Nora looked at him. Her face did something quiet and full in the April dark. "He decided that himself," Jesse said. "I didn't ask for it." "He decides most things himself," she said. "He gets that from Thomas. I think he gets some of it from you." She considered this. Maybe. They sat in the quiet that was the good kind of quiet, not empty but full. The way evenings were full when the house contained people who had chosen to be in it when the work of the day was done and the next day's work was not yet pressing, and the moment had permission to be exactly what it was. Eli's voice came from inside from his room in the way children's voices came when they were not yet fully asleep. "Are you still on the porch?" "Yes," Nora said. "Are you coming in?" "In a little while." A pause, then okay. A longer pause, then Papa. Jesse looked at the door. "Yes. The robin came back today. I saw it by the fence." "I know, you told me. I just wanted to make sure you remembered." "I remembered," Jesse said. Silence from inside. The good silence of a child settling into sleep. Jesse and Nora sat on the porch and watched the mountain go dark and the stars come out one by one in the order they always came. The creek ran. The chickens were quiet in the barn. The smoke had stopped rising from the chimney because the evening was warm enough now that the fire was no longer needed. Spring had come. The garden Thomas had shown Nora how to plant in the first year of their marriage was still in the same place, a habit of the earth that held the shape of what had been placed there even through the long winter. She had put seeds in 3 weeks ago, kneeling in the cold mud, and Eli had helped pressing each seed into the ground with the same care he gave to his stones. Something was growing. Not the seeds, it was too early for the seeds, but something in the ground. Something the winter had not taken, something that had been waiting for exactly this. The light lasting a little longer each day, the temperature rising by degrees so small they were imperceptible, except in accumulation, the world moving as it always moved toward what came next. Everything comes back, Jesse thought, given the right home. He reached for Nora's hand on the armrest of the chair between them, and she turned her palm up to receive it, and that was the whole of it. That was all it needed to be. The mountain stood at the edge of town, patient and immovable, and not afraid of being what it was. The letter from Franklin Greer was in Jesse's coat pocket, and in the morning he would put it in the cedar box with the rest of the things worth keeping. The robins were back. Spring had come to stay.